Hi, I'm Holly Hughes. I'm the editor of Photo District News, and I'm delighted to be here today with Natalie Keyssar, a photojournalist who's just back from Venezuela. Your 8th trip to Venezuela? Your, third trip this year, you said?
Yes.
Natalie, her clients include Wall Street Journal, Time, New York Times Magazine, California Sunday Magazine, Bloomberg Business Week. And we're also delighted that Natalie is one of many women photographers quoted in our article, which is up on pdnonline.com today, about sexism in photography. And Natalie has some provocative things to say about sexism, particularly in photojournalism. Natalie, one of the things I know you've talked about is this perception among editors that sending women photographers to cover conflict or civil strife, women are more of a liability than male photographers. Is that a perception among editors? What do you say to that?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, first of all, and for talking about this issue. It's really important. Yes, I think for many reasons. I mean, primarily patriarchy in society in all its forms, but there is a perception that the normal photojournalist is a man, that the normal risks are risks to men, and that therefore, like, a woman is extraordinary, that it's riskier, that it's more dangerous. And of course, there are risks that are unique to women, and there is a terrible phenomenon in human society across country borders of violence against women, of rape, of gendered violence that's outrageous and needs to change top to bottom. But especially in terms of covering violence, hard news, civil unrest, conflict type of situations, I do feel very, very strongly that the risks to women and men are different, but that they're not necessarily greater risks to women or less risks to men. I mean, I think it's very dangerous to start to think of women, and this is something I said to David in the interview for the article. Women photojournalists are not male photojournalists plus risk of gendered violence. We have a different perspective. We're women photojournalists. We're not special. We're not less than. We're not weaker. You know that. And due to the same stereotypes which might put us in danger in certain situations, I find that there are many violent situations, or especially when you're dealing with sort of tough guys, armed men, dangerous types, where the fact that I might walk into a situation alone, open-handed, saying, "Hi, can I take your picture?" I feel much safer doing that than perhaps some of my male colleagues who might be perceived as more of a threat. I feel like I get often in certain situations get a little bit more space for conversation, for explanation. You know, I'm able to negotiate certain things and safely navigate certain situations that I don't necessarily think would be as easy for men. So I think there's really that push and pull, and I think it's very, very important in the conversation about safety for women that we continue to have the incredibly important conversation about all of the risks that women alone in society, women journalists face, but that we don't ever get into the idea that women can't work alone or that we are a higher risk than men to send out there. Because I never want my discussion of sexism in the world and the industry to somehow get equated with, you know, we can't have women working alone out there. It's my worst nightmare, and I think it's, you know, that's an unfounded perspective.
Some of the women we talk to in this issue talk about how they tend to be pigeonholed to what editors consider like women's stories. Has that happened to you, and how do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's such a pet peeve of mine, to be honest. You know, it's unbelievable how many well-intentioned editors or mentor figures will say, "Oh, why don't you do a women's story?" You know, and women's issues are deeply important to me. And frankly, without having the intention of setting out to do women's stories, I find that I gravitate towards women's subjects. You know, somebody smart once said that artists always try to make self-portraits in whatever art they create. And of course, I see myself and I relate to other women in a way that I don't necessarily see myself and relate to other men, or men. And, so I do gravitate towards female subjects, but I think it's really ignorant to assume that women need to only cover women's issues in the way that it would be ignorant to think men only need to cover men's issues, or only local photographers can, we need a diversity and a sort of a spider web of perspectives and telling stories. I think it's also really important to not think that, only that women somehow all represent one perspective or one way of working, or that men or that photographers of color or white photographers. I mean, we really need to mix this up and be sensitive to representation always, but please, nobody else tell me or any other young female photographers that they should focus on women's issues, because it's silly.
Well, I guess I'd also say I wish that editors understood that a women's issue is a human issue. But you mentioned this perception that a journalist is a man and white and Western. What do you think we're missing when that stereotype prevails in the media?
Everything. I think at this stage in the conversation, at least among the journalist community, we all understand that the world is suffering under an oppression generated by colonialism, generated by white supremacy, generated by patriarchy. That's my jumping off point. If there's debate about that, I don't know what to do.
I'm nodding.
And I think it's also something that I really want to point out early, that the debate about sexism in journalism is very, very important to me, and it's a profound inequality, but also the position of a white woman is a position of privilege. And I think it's really, really important that we women that are, speaking out against sexism in photojournalism now are also super aware of the fact that the struggle for gender equality can't ever be mentioned without the struggle for racial equality and equality across ethnicities, gender identities. There's all these different things, and that I really think we always need to make sure to be listening to each other, acknowledging our own privilege, and trying to listen better and push harder in solidarity with everyone. And what?
So what are we missing from the media when too much of that one perspective is dominant in our media?
I think we lose so much. We lose understanding. We lose empathy. Again, it reinforces the idea that the white man is the norm of a human being, and that everything else is secondary, is other. It whitewashes, like, no pun intended, it whitewashes our perspective. It makes every woman, every person of color, every person who's not American or from a European country feel like they're outside, and it also really robs everyone, including white men, of the ability to understand other perspectives. And in such a terribly polarized country as we're in today, and many other polarized countries that I work in, lack of empathy is a violent, destructive force that's reinforced by a homogeneous perspective.
You're mentioning that you've mentioned to me that you're starting to teach, and you are reaching out to other women photographers where you've taught in a different way, and trying to foster them. Like, what do you do as a mentor to reach out to them or to encourage them? Do you have advice for them?
Yeah, well, I have certainly ideas. I started shooting about 7-8 years ago now, is that right? Yeah. And, I had a journey, into photojournalism and sort of trying to claw my way into the industry and experiencing all kinds of sexism and microaggressions and things of that nature. And, it took several years into establishing myself and really finally forming relationships with many other women, which it took a while to find because we're always in the minority. So I sort of went about over the years making friends with people like Daniela Zollman, who was the first person, who's the founder of Women Photograph, which is a super important organization for this conversation, obviously. You know, Daniela was pretty much, when I first started at the Wall Street Journal, she was one of the only other women freelancing for the Wall Street Journal Metro team. Meeting people like, you know, Katie Orlinsky. I mean, most of my best friends now are other women photographers, and building this community and starting to have these conversations of like, this person said this to me, this is how I'm perceived. Starting to realize that the way that I was treated and the way that other women photographers was treated was not normal. It wasn't okay. Being reinforced by the fact that we were all having this collective experience that was very different from the experience of our male colleagues at the same point in their careers. You know, so over several years, I started to get outraged. I started to receive support, exchange stories with other women, and now that I'm a little bit more advanced in my career and I'm starting to mentor some young photographers who are just starting out, I don't want them to go through 5 years of sucking it up and thinking that it's normal. I don't want them to feel that there's no alternative than to just eat it when somebody sexually harasses you, to say nothing when you're constantly underestimated, to just deal with this. You know, if we can start having the conversation with women that have been through 20 years of this that I look up to, and also women that are younger than me, and I can say, hey, you don't have to take that. Let's fight this together. Then hopefully that starts to create a space for change. And, you know, one thing that I've started to do, and one thing that I think we're all starting to do, and I think this is also a little bit facilitated by like internet groups, by Women Photograph, is to start talking to younger photographers and saying like, hey, are you okay? Like, how's being a woman in your circles? Are you interacting with any predators? Do you know what that looks like? Does anybody make you feel bad for being a woman? Or, you know, and in that way, I think we can start to create solidarity. And the only thing that I would add to that is that my mom is a longtime feminist and really raised me as such. And when I started to tell her about this phenomenon, she's like, oh, you guys are just making women's groups like we did in the 60s. Like, how is this conversation still happening?
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes I get really frustrated that we're just going to endlessly have to fight this fight and reinvent the wheel, but I'm up for it.
You've covered politics, you've covered conflict, you've worked on a variety of news stories where you're one of very few women photographers, where there are a lot of photographers around, right? And you've also formed the Black Box Collective with some male photographers. So I'm curious to know how fellow male photographers treat you or react to you, and if you have any advice for men who want to be allies.
Yeah, I mean, you know, lots of my best friends are male photographers. I like male photographers, guys. I like male photo editors. I like female photo editors. I like everyone in the industry. But yeah, there's being one of few women. I'm almost always, I would say, you know, the female representation in, you know, covering politics on the campaign trail for Time magazine last year, or where I work in Venezuela, or covering Black Lives Matter, whatever. I'm, you know, if there are maybe 10% women, maybe, you know, if there's 20 men, there's usually like 2 women, and
how do they treat you? All the guys.
You
on
know,
the bus
it's a mixed bag. There are men that are sort of instinctively lovely and allies and respectful and supportive without ever treating you like you are less than. Mm-hmm. There are, you know, and those folks are wonderful to work with. There are men that are really conscious and trying but sort of blow it anyways. And we'll talk about that in a second, about how to be an ally. You know, and there are men that are just awful. You know, there are men that underestimate you, that, you know, I mean, I being on assignment for Time magazine on the campaign trail, the number of men that just were incredulous that a woman my age was really working for Time. I mean, it was really, people, that assume that you're a student, people that assume that you couldn't possibly be working for who you say you were, people like Time like the magazine, really, people that don't want to make space for you, people that are uncomfortable because they're really used to like being surrounded by all men and, objectifying women all day, and all of a sudden you're there and they don't know what to, there's lots of microaggressions, basically, and we're not talking about, the worst thing in the world, but it amounts to an uncomfortable environment. In terms of how to be an ally, and this is in social spaces, in work spaces, I think in terms of social progress, in terms of equality, we have we've really started to have these conversations, and I think that's great, and it's very public, but everybody wants it to be right, and everybody's terrified of getting anything wrong. And I think that can be sort of a counterproductive process. Allies need to ask questions, and they need to be allowed to, of course, there's certain people get to a point where they just don't want to answer the same stupid question, or they're really frustrated with certain situations. But I think that we as feminists in the industry can try to make as much space as possible to educate, to let men who want to be allies listen. What do I, because also many women feel different. Being an ally is more about listening and being sensitive than I think it is about like a one-size-fits-all approach to all women photographers. There are things that one of the things that drives me crazy that almost all of my male photographer friends do, who are allies and who are lovely and who are super woke men, is they talk over us. They don't listen to us. It's constant. It drives me insane. The number of men that talk over women who are their friends, who they respect is really incredible. And if all of them could just start with listening and to not listen to this conversation about sexism in the industry, like, oh, am I in trouble? No, I'm a good guy, but listen, try to help. Understand that all of us are contributing to this dynamic. Every single one of us, men and women, and we all need to change because we are what composes this industry. So nobody's starting from perfect. You don't need to put your head down. Like, ask the necessary questions, listen to the answer, constantly be trying to do better. I find that certain things that bother me are like exceptionalizing women. This woman is okay, but you're not like the other girl photographers. You're really tough. I don't know what stupid thing. No, like stop, to call out that kind of behavior, to really be, a lot of times there are men present in a space where sexual harassment or sort of uncomfortable conversation of women is happening, especially in social spaces for photographers. The men who know that's not cool, and they should know that's not cool. Sometimes we women get sick of having to call out machismo and sexism, and it would, be really, really nice if the guys would step in and be like, hey, that's a totally inappropriate, unprofessional, unacceptable way to be speaking, whether there's a woman present or not. It creates a toxic culture. It's stuff like that.
Okay, so let's talk about, several women we interviewed said that the usual places where photographers network and get to know photo editors and get to know clients and have clients get to know them are sort of social industry events that can be really fraught for young women. Would you say that's true? And if so, what's a young woman photographer to do if those are going to be tricky places?
I think that like the networking events, festivals and stuff like that, being fraught is a really great illustration of two of the things I see as really key in why photojournalism has such a gender problem. The first is inequality in terms of finance and job security. The fact that we've got an almost entirely freelance photojournalist force, and that all photojournalists are essentially a beggar class to the power brokers in this industry, that we need to be given assignments, that our next assignment is almost never guaranteed. None of us are making any money. All of that sort of inequality, the sort of constant like rights grabbiness, all of that stuff, all of that insecurity creates a space where a predator, a person who's sexually harassing, or even female editors that perpetuate the sort of perception that that don't hire women, or that are sort of judgmental of other women. I mean, there's all kinds of bad dynamics happen, and we are completely beholden to them because there's no union. We don't have a job. You don't have to fire us. If we take you on, it's me, little person, calling out sexual harassment or sexism or inappropriate commentary. Like, I don't have a job. You have an office with a legal team. There's no, that sort of inequality from a sort of economic and job security perspective is a huge problem. And then there's patriarchy, right? And then there's just the fundamentals of like gender double standards of, you're at a photo festival and like a girl acts wild and like, woof, that was really unclassy behavior, and a guy acts wild and like, well, he's a really tough guy and he's drinking away his last trip to a conflict zone. And, and these are tiny examples of a huge cesspool of problems. But like, when you pair patriarchy with that kind of inequality in terms of the power structure of our industry and the lack of security, you're going to have a disaster on your hands. And people have been taking advantage of that in various ways, and women have been getting the short end of stick of that for my entire short tenure in this industry. So
you mean a few people hold the keys to the next assignment, they hold the key to connections that will lead to assignment or more work as an assistant or something, and then they can abuse that power that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even if you get there are like, and all of the women in the industry know there are people who are predators. There are people who take advantage of there are men who take advantage of their power in the industry, whether it be as an editor, as a mentor figure, as somebody who has some kind of leverage in the industry to sexually harass young women, to try to get dates with young women. I mean, this is like a known thing, and it's a huge problem, and we all know it, and I think many of us have really had it with that dynamic. One. But then there's also this sort of sick thing where instead of photojournalism being about photojournalism, because it sort of really comes down to some editors really hire because they respect your talent, but some editors hire who they like or who has a good reputation, and then things start to get really messy, a young woman becomes judged for behavior that's totally acceptable for a young man to do, and in terms of these situations like portfolio reviews and festivals, everyone is desperately trying to get their foot in the door, and there is a smaller group of gatekeepers, and like, maybe a comment makes them uncomfortable, or maybe they are really there because they want to get sent to cover, some kind of hard news situation, and the editor says, like, you'd be really great for this women's story. I mean, it could be something like that, right? And you're thinking, like, well, this editor is a big deal. It's amazing that he likes my work. There's no sexual harassment. This is just a normal business. But, like, hey, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean that, like, that I don't want to go do a portrait project. Like, I'm here because I want to shoot the action, and you just took one look at me and assumed otherwise. But am I gonna, like, in that situation where I'm so excited to be even getting a chance, be like, excuse me, I think that you're really perpetuating a stereotype here. Like, no.
Yeah.
And those are, this is the scale, right? It goes from, hey, let's get a drink after this portfolio review, and the woman having to choose between no, creep, and I'll never work for you again or any of your friends, or sure, and maybe I don't want to. That's to, like, why don't you do women's stories? Because I don't want to. It's that and everything in between.
Well, what you're describing is a culture in which it's really hard for women to pipe up and speak. But I get the impression that from talking to women, more and more people are speaking out. Do you have any advice about how to have an honest conversation with people in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that like this conversation has really come to the front recently, like this year, and of course it's had many incarnations, and there's many, many women that, came ahead of my generation blazing this trail and fighting this fight and fighting worse parts of this fight. But, Daniela, by launching Women Photograph, I think has really created a big space for us to really push and a community for us to discuss this stuff, and I really think it's helping a lot, and I'm super grateful to her. I
will say I think photo editors are grateful to be able to follow Women Photograph and be introduced to new talent as well. But anyway, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I know, and I feel like I've been seeing some positive results, from this conversation from Women Photograph. I think it's a good thing. In terms of talking about it, for me, of course, certain things make us really angry. And it's really great to have a community of women to vent and air it out with. But I think the most productive way I can have this conversation for me personally, and this is very personal stuff, is to try to channel that outrage and frustration and into something productive. And that means trying to talk to people really calmly, be really professional, consult the network of women. If a woman ever reaches out to me that she's having a problem with sexism in the industry, I don't know what I can do to help, but I will always respond. And I know that many, many, many women in this industry feel the same way. And, if things need to be addressed, and they very often do, it depends. There's some people that are predatory and that are sexist and that treat women badly in this industry, and we need to push back hard, and they need to get out because they're a problem. And everybody's been sucking it up for too long, and there's some people that just need to go. I mean, and I'm not talking about specific people, I'm talking about like culturally, that if somebody is being predatory to their students, if somebody only ever hires men, they either need to change that behavior. If you're being predatory to students, for instance, then like out of here. There's other situations where like we, I think, can really try to be educators. I had a dear friend who I love recently say, but like, are you guys, is this really such a big deal, the whole women in photography thing? And I just was like, hey, like, how many women do you know that work for major news agencies? Because he was a wire photographer, and he was like, oh. And I was like, what do the male photographers say about us when we're not around? And he was like, oof. And he was like, point taken. And it wasn't a fight. I love this guy. I like really care about him. He's a great friend. But and I could have gotten furious because you're negating our struggle. But I think it was more helpful in the situation to say like, dude, look at this situation. And I think in as much as we can be combative where we need to be combative, and also nurturing and educators when we need to do that. Those are the two avenues that I see making change.
So I think you've given some encouragement to women to pipe up, and some men to be a little bit more vocal around other men. These sound positive to me. Do you have any hopeful thoughts on what's happening in terms of hiring and opportunities and recognizing women photographers' talents?
I do think that like the conversation I'm seeing of women really of women and hopefully men too, being sick of, 10, 15, 20% of front pages of most of the important publications being shot by women, of the winners of all of the contests being 10%. I'm hoping that this pushback
being only 10% women.
Being only 10% women.
Awards, yeah.
That I'm hoping that the sense industry-wide that people are really watching this behavior will, and I think it really is having that effect if people are saying, dude, I gotta diversify who I hire, because if not, whether it's for fear of coming under fire or recognition like, hey, this perspective is getting boring, that does give me a lot of hope. And I think that as the chorus of women's voices and minorities' voices starts to say, we're not gonna take micro or macro aggressions anymore, and we are going to call it out and we are going to fight back, and people see that there are large swaths of the industry that are receptive and supportive to that. I really hope that we can make a change. Is the experience of my mom, the feminist, who feels like she's had this conversation 50 years ago, a little discouraging? Absolutely, but there is nothing to do but push forward.
What about advice? It's not only up to photographers. Do you have any advice for the photo editor who suddenly says, yeah, I really need to diversify? What's your advice to the photo editors?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like I discover a new photographer who's an inspiration to me every week, on social media, or that shot something, and maybe it's not even within photojournalism, but just as the premise of why women photograph was created, if you scratch the surface, then they're there. And I think precisely because minority perspectives and women's perspectives are a little bit different sometimes than the norm, and I really do think that shows in the work. I find that I'm, often really attracted to those visions, and I all you have to do is scratch the surface and you're going to find a ton of amazing photographers out there. And that doesn't mean that you have to forsake your regulars that you want to be loyal to, because I appreciate and respect that loyalty. But and I do think I'm seeing people really branching out. One thing that I've really benefited from, but I also think needs to be a baby step towards progress, is women's issues. The women's issue of X magazine, I've been really honored and grateful to be hired to shoot for the women's issue of a lot of great publications, and I'm not knocking that, and I really respect that work, and it's been great. But if just because you just did a women's issue doesn't mean that it's okay to go back to only having one photographer out of your 14 in the next issue. Tokenism in all of its forms is a really, really weak attempt at diversifying, and we just need to start being conscious of that and do better every day, from the small stuff to who we hire to all of that. And I do feel that I'm seeing a lot of people make an effort. And I've had a lot of editors reach out to me and say hey, I'm looking for a Black photographer to tell this story. I'm looking for a woman photographer. I'm looking for a photographer who is native to X country. And that really gives me a lot of hope when I get those kinds of inquiries.
So it's not all horror stories. There's some hope out there that people can take some encouragement from.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of horror stories, but it's galvanizing people, and I really do feel that a lot of us have just had enough, and a lot of people that were afraid to speak up before are speaking up, and I think that momentum will continue, and I think that it's just going to be. I think it is becoming unacceptable to have an all-white male photography staff, and it's just, I'm starting to get embarrassed for people that are still doing it, and I think that they're going to start getting embarrassed for themselves soon, and I hope it's for the right reasons, because they're realizing how much better the photography will be if it reflects all different perspectives, but if it's for shame, cool, same thing. You need to hire women and minorities.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, Holly.